is made available to us as the public. He has been very successful in working on two very large investments for the state in infrastructure over the last several years, including a bill that recently passed in the 2021 legislative session. And of course, as you know, that includes the new Mississippi River Bridge. You may have seen his face a little bit promoting that as of late. Both of those investments have been done without raising taxes. He is also a member of the Revenue Fiscal Affairs Committee and Judiciary B. Senator Ward is a graduate of Bethany Christian School, of LSU, of Southern University Law Center, and he does practice law with the firm of Clayton, Rouge, and Ward. He is married with 3 children, and we're about to find out if one has a broken wrist today from recess. And when he is not in the legislature or practicing law, he is always spending time with his children. I am one of his Facebook friends, and they are the cutest little hunters in their camo that you can see. He's here to talk to us today about particularly the legislature's concerns with our communication infrastructure and how that was affected following Hurricane Ida, as well as a lot of the brick and mortar and concrete infrastructure that we as a state need to address as well. So please welcome for me Senator Rick Ward.
Well, thank you all for having me today. My name is Rick Ward, and I represent Senate District 17, and I have for about 10 years now. It's certainly been an honor. I think we've been able to do some pretty good things, and have a couple of years left to keep working at it, and hopefully we can do a few more before now and the end of the my last term. But as we all know, we just went through a massive hurricane, and of course those seem to be more prevalent in terms of their impact and on an annual basis. And so actually the first committee I had as chair of commerce was a joint committee where we heard from both the telecommunications, the folks from our power grid and things like that, to try and really get a handle on what happened and what are we going to do going forward to try and brace ourselves for as these things go or become more of an issue on an annual basis. And you know, a lot of things they were able to answer. Some things they still need more information that they're gathering, so we're going to have a follow-up hearing on that. But I think it's interesting, you know, as time changes, what we all rely on as a society seem to change as well. And so maybe 30 years ago, the most important thing was power. And while power is extremely important and is probably still the most important thing, our ability to communicate, our ability to run our businesses from a broadband standpoint and all those types of things, those are a very serious impact and are something that it's vital that they come back to life just as quickly maybe as our power grid. And so and really even before you get to that, from an emergency standpoint, what we saw during the storm was some severe outages from not just folks that wanted to communicate with family, because I think that to some degree is understandable. What we did see that was alarming, and until we can get all the answers for it, I think will continue to be disturbing to some, is how so much of our emergency communications were down in a time where they were most needed. And I think in future committee hearings we will get better answers to what caused those things. But whenever you have emergency personnel trying to respond to life and death situations and they can't communicate, that is completely unacceptable. So we have to figure out how to make that function, how to make sure that stays shored up no matter what we're dealing with at the time. And I think in some cases, some places we're able to go pull out like some really old radios and things and communicate that way. But, you know, of course, the amount of those they had to provide to their personnel were probably limited, and even to be able to get them spread out to the people that needed them was probably a difficult task in and of itself. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area, but it's something that we've got to get right, because it's a matter of saving lives whenever you're dealing with something like hurricanes or floods or anything like that. So we'll continue to push that issue, not just in the Commerce Committee, but I know whenever you look at telecommunications and things like that, and the tiers of those they report to or really are regulated by, the legislature is probably like number 3 on that list of people that they're obligated to. So we'll work on that. I do see it getting better in the future. I really hope it does. It's a necessary factor. In terms of the power grid, I think that really ties into infrastructure and how do you have a power source that is affordable, but at the same time doesn't collapse and doesn't look. There's just some storms that I believe there's only so much you can do, and you have to be able to just be prepared as best you can to go back and get back online as quickly as possible. But I do think, as we all know, who ultimately bears the burden of repaying that amount of money is the ratepayer. As some of you probably may still have in some cases, but remember, going back to Katrina and Gustav and things like that, you end up with maybe a $10 or a $5, whatever amount it is, surcharge on your bill, and that is from they divvy up the amount of money that is required to go back and rebuild the grid, and then it's paid back through surcharges over a period of many years. And so I guess the concern is, from my standpoint, if you start having these things on an annual basis and those surcharges start stacking up on your bill, that can be very problem. You still might have a low rate in terms of the power production and all that, but what are you doing, you know, if you end up having $40 in surcharges because you had 4 hurricanes in the course of 3 or 4 years? And so but there's a balancing act, you know. If you spend too much money in trying to build it to sustain something that doesn't happen too frequently, then that can also make the cost to where it's not sustainable for a lot of the population of the state. So I think that's something that we have to work with, but we've got to figure it out. It's all part of really infrastructure as a whole. You've got communications, telecommunications, broadband. Of course, we've been having a lot of emphasis put on rural broadband. We've made some steps in terms of starting to direct some dollars there, but I don't think we've started to see the results of that yet. If you live in a rural area, you probably understand best how difficult it can be, even if it's just your kids home, maybe out sick for a few days, and they have to try and, whether it be in today's world, maybe they're trying to stream their class so they can follow along with the teacher, or maybe it's just simply downloading some assignments from a teacher. It can be nearly impossible. So in all aspects, that has to continue to be a focus. And I know there was $300 million set aside over the last year or so, but we need to see that stuff start to roll out and begin to make those things better. I guess kind of on to my what's been my favorite topic the last few years, which has really been kind of the roads and bridges and that sort of thing in terms of infrastructure. I feel like we've finally started to make some strides in terms of investing or putting the pieces in place to invest. I think where we're still lacking is the speed in which we do that, because part of the distrust of the general public and us as elected officials is certainly understandable, because a lot of times we may leave session and I may go home and say, this big project is fully funded. And then 4 years later, they're looking at me and saying, you told us it was fully funded and they hadn't turned the first piece of dirt yet. So what are we doing? And so I think while we've started to get some funding mechanisms in place to start dealing with our $14 billion backlog of roads and bridges, we've got to figure out a way to speed that process up. Now, I can tell you one of the reasons why we move so slowly, at least in my opinion, is the average state, about 45 or so % of the dollars they spend on their roads and all those sorts of things are federal dollars. We average about 78, just under 80% of the dollars we spend are federal dollars. The other 20-something % is state dollars. So what happens there is, even in the smallest of projects, whenever the money you're using to go do that project is tied to federal funding, it can take up to 18 months, maybe 22 months to do something that should be very, very simple, because you have to meet certain criteria that the federal government requires before you can ever go build. One example I tend to use all the time, in Point QP Parish, they had just a little rural bridge, but it was probably about a $500,000 replacement that needed to take place. The only funding available for that was tied to federal dollars. Now, this is something that could have been done in a matter of months, but because the money available for it was tied to federal funds, they had to go through all sorts of, we all hear about all the different studies and things. They had to go through about an 18-month study and do all these things for something that just needed to be replaced. It wasn't new, it wasn't a new path, a new road, new right-of-way, anything, just a replacement. And so I think if we can ever get to a point where a larger percentage of our dollars being expended on our roads and bridges are state dollars as opposed to federal dollars, that way we can maybe keep a portion of it separated. I think we would have the ability, at least on some of the smaller projects, to move faster. And in doing so, I think the public would feel better about things in terms of us actually accomplishing what we say at the Capitol that we just accomplished. Just in terms of kind of prioritizing our spending as a state and making it a priority, in the last, I guess, 3 years now, we've taken some significant steps. Back in, I think it was 2019, my years start to get a little fuzzy, but they had some economic damage dollars that were going to be coming into the state from the BP settlement, the oil spill settlement. And at the time, the money was just slated to go into the general fund. It was going to be about $50 million annually for 13 years. And a group of us got together and decided that, if we just simply put it in the general fund, we're going to wake up 10 years from now, 13 years from now, and it'll have been spent on various things, but we will have nothing to show for it. And it's essentially one-time dollars, so you certainly don't want to allow your budget to grow by $50 million just simply because you have it for that brief period of time. So what could we do with it constructive, where we could all look back and say it made a significant impact on the state and wasn't just kind of gobbled up to not into the black hole of the budget, so to speak. And so what came out of that was a bill that divvied up the money kind of on a regional basis, but it had to meet certain criteria and priorities. And it was about a $750 million investment over a 12-year period, 13-year period, that was also able to draw down much more federal funds and a few other things for, I guess, around about a $1.2 billion total investment in our state's infrastructure over the upcoming years. Some of those projects have begun. I think the largest one is set to start, the LA one down in Golden Meadow. That's set to start here for pretty soon. I think they just announced who won the bid to do that, and that was really a fun process to be a part of. The way the bill was written, it helped us get what was that year the largest infra grant in the country, and so in order to make that project work, we were able to piece together really three things: the money that the legislature dedicated to it, which was $150 million, the big infra grant, which was, I forget the exact amount of that, and then the private industry in the Port of Fourchon and that region were putting up about $50 million. So collectively, everybody was able to work together and make sure that that was something that was done, and just to see it finally about to start is exciting. But I tell that mainly to kind of go back to where I was a few minutes ago, which is this: the bill was passed in 2019 with some of these things fully funded, and in terms of kind of the larger scale projects that were in that bill, here we are in the final quarter of 2021, and we're just now about to hopefully start the first project. Some of the other ones are still a year or more away before they can begin. And so while it's exciting, we've got to figure out a way to make all those things happen at a much faster pace. The most recent thing that we did in terms of infrastructure was we took a portion of the vehicle sales tax that has been going to the general fund. But when the vehicle sales tax was originally put in place, the intention of it was for it to go to roads and bridges. In fact, that's what a lot of other states do. It kind of makes sense. You buy a car, you pay sales tax. Your car is going to go up and down the roads. Let's pay for some new roads and some new bridges, or the maintenance of the existing roads and bridges with that sales tax. Things happened over time, like they tend to do, and it ended up in the general fund and never made its way there. I think there was a bill that may have done it in the past that got vetoed, but I don't remember exactly if that's what happened. So anyway, we took 60% of that money, not all of it, 60% of it, which is roughly $300 million annually, and we're dedicating it to the Transportation Trust Fund, but specifically the portion of it that is only allowed for construction. So one of the complaints that we get a lot of times as legislators is, well, we don't want any more funds going to transportation because they're going to end up using it for salaries and benefits and all those sorts of things. So the construction sub-fund was set up so that any dollar amount that's put in the construction sub-fund of the Transportation Trust Fund can only be used for construction. That's where this money will land. Out of that $300 million or so annually, you can bond out about 150 million of it, so roughly half. The other 150 million is going to be left where you can only use it on an annual basis, and the reason for that is just kind of as a safety net, a precaution, so to speak. We wanted we wanted to be able to make sure that if we ever ran into a large deficit again, there would be some measure to claw back that money if need be. One of the things that we are really terrible at as a legislature as a whole is we like to tie our hands. At the time, we do some things and it makes sense, and then 5 years later, you're having to deal with the constraints of a statute that requires X dollars to go here and X dollars to go there, and so whenever you're left with fighting a shortfall or something like that, you're very limited in what you can do to address it. So that was one of the safety measures that we put in, was half of it. I believe it is, if the deficit, if the annual deficit is $100 million or above, then a portion of that, or up to all of that $150 million, can revert back to the general fund as needed. So within that bill, we also listed out, there's a section for mega projects, and then another section of other more regional projects that were kind of geared towards some of your rural areas and things like that. 75% of the money, up to 75% of the money, will go to the mega projects, such as the Baton Rouge Bridge, Lake Charles Bridge, maybe the I-49 that will connect Lafayette to New Orleans, to go ahead and finish that out. And then no less than 25% will go to the other remaining things, which is essentially for rural roads and bridges. And so, I don't know exactly what that split ends up being. It could end up being 60-40, 50-50, but no more than 75 can go to the megas, and no less than 25% can go to the other things. So overall, that was probably one of the more fun things I've worked on since I've been in the legislature, just because so many people worked so hard on it, and then at the end, it really brought a lot of people together. I think the last vote we took on it in the Senate, I think it was, I think all 39 people voted in favor of it, which is on something that is pretty monumental. You don't see that often. And then in the House, I think it got maybe 85 or 88 votes. So I think what it does tell you is that the legislature as a whole, not just because of what we think as individuals up there, but I think because of what we hear from our constituents, we do understand that it's time to make infrastructure, and I don't just mean roads and bridges, but all the things we've talked about, rural broadband, our power grid, although that's mostly a private issue, but we can help with some things in terms of how all that stuff's laid out. But all these things that are really necessary for a good, healthy lifestyle in terms of a good economy and growing our economy and all those sorts of things. Everybody in the legislature, I feel like, has come to an understanding that our constituents really want us to make that a priority, because that's kind of like the most basic thing that is needed for a society to function in terms of getting to school, getting to work, getting to the grocery store. You've got to have all that functioning. And if you live in the Baton Rouge region, there's some days that leave you questioning if it actually functions. So I could talk a while, but I'd love to answer any questions.
A lot of the money that goes to the road repairs and maintenance is maybe from a gasoline tax, as you well know, and with all the push on electric cars, granted that money doesn't get us nearly the bang for the buck it used to back in '85, I believe, when it was first put on the books. Has there been any talk about how they're going to replace that once the electric cars, they say 15 years, whether that really happens or not, who knows? But
I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion out there. I think just in terms of new funding for roads and bridges, it's been part of a discussion. I think one of the ways I look at it is if you're trying to do something to generate more or even the same revenue as you currently have, let's just say you went and passed a 10-cent gas tax tomorrow, it really makes no sense because it's on a downward trajectory, and the day you pass it, it's deteriorating at a rate that you have the value of what it brings going down, as well as inflation of everything it has to buy going up, and so you're doing this. I always use my wife's vehicle as an example. We had I think a 2011 Suburban. It got 11 miles to the gallon. We buy a 2015 Suburban, and it got on the highway, I think, 21 miles to the gallon. I mean, that was a 4 or 5 year difference. We're not talking about 15 or 20 years and what things will look like then. So even before you get to electric vehicles, just fuel efficiency alone has that number deteriorating. So there's got to be some sort of alternative to that over time. I don't know what it looks like. I do think that the vehicle sales tax, it captures every vehicle sold. Like right now, an electric vehicle, and I have a number of friends that have them and love them. They pay nothing to operate on the road because they're not paying any gas tax. So, and a lot of people would argue they're heavier than the average vehicle because of the batteries and all those sorts of things. So you got to figure out a way to make it balanced and make it work going forward. But I don't know exactly what that's going to look like.
Going back to the Commerce Committee, I was there, and there was a lot of frustration around AT&T and the failure after the storm, especially with I believe it's called FirstNet, with the first responders. And there was a notion that, maybe the state should rethink their contract with them. Has there been any more answers from AT&T, and do you think that's going to be a real discussion in the legislature?
I'm sure there'll be ongoing discussion about that. We will have another joint commerce meeting. I don't know exactly when. If I had to guess, probably sometime in November. Whether or not, I don't know. I don't have the contract in terms of knowing the length of time, what the state can do to get out of the current contract, all those sorts of things. But I do think just overall, the discussion of do we look in a different direction, or what do we do to make sure this doesn't happen anymore? Because, I mean, everybody from what I understand, everybody from the governor's staff on down to local officials at various times when they were dealing with the storm had no communication. So it's something that's going to have to be looked at. I don't know what the final outcome of that'll be.
Yeah, I've seen you tweet a few times about insurance issues following Ida, or maybe not even Ida, just in general. And I'm wondering, it seems like after Ida, there's this appetite, maybe this appetite in the legislature for reforms, or I'm wondering what you think that might look like. What sort of regulations might be strengthened, or what you think that'll look like in this upcoming session?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's certainly going to be some discussion about it. What we actually do, I don't know. I think there's always a bunch of different reasons given why insurance kind of takes the position they do, in particular after disasters. But you've got to take a hard look at figuring out what do you do to make sure that people that pay monthly premiums actually get, in response to those premiums, what they've paid for. But it can be very difficult. I guess after maybe after the first few months of the COVID situation in a special session, I had a bill to remember the business interruption insurance issue. I don't know if you remember that, but basically 90-something% of the people that had business interruption insurance were not covered. And business interruption insurance can be extremely costly. I mean, it's one of the more costly things you can buy as a part of a policy. So the bill was really pretty simple when we amended it down to what we liked it to do, and it made it through the Senate. But all we were asking to do was a one sheet of paper that listed out all the exemptions or all the things that would not be covered under the policy. Seems pretty straightforward. And the response at the table in opposition to the bill was all the exemptions in most of the policy would not be able to fit on one sheet of paper, therefore they couldn't do it. So then it kind of makes you wonder what you're buying, right? But so even something as simple as that, it seems like that would have been a really easy thing to pass. It didn't work out, but I think it'll be part of the conversation. I just don't know what that'll look like.
What are some things the state can do to reduce its dependency on federal dollars to get some of these road and bridge projects done at a more efficient time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things we can do. One is we have to continue to make it a priority in terms of our budget and taking dollars when we have the opportunity and allocating to those things. But then I think the second step to that is we also need to make sure that we take a portion of the money of those state dollars and keep them completely separate from federal dollars. So on some of those small projects like I talked about a few minutes ago, it doesn't take 22 months to do, whereas if it was just state dollars and we didn't have to go through some of these federal studies and federal regulations that required to use the money, if it was just state dollars, maybe they get done in 3 months or 4 months or something like that. So I think, but I think the first step in that is continuing to prioritize within our budget the dollars we have and make infrastructure and roads and bridges a priority in this state, which it hasn't been in over 40 years. Go ahead.
In that same meeting, there was a lot of talk of hardening the grid so there's not all this repair after every storm. And I believe it was Entergy who said, burying the lines, things like that would be too expensive. But would you say that it'd be worthwhile to make that a priority and invest in that rather than continuing for customers to have these extra charges?
Well, and so that's where it comes into a balancing act, right? So if you have to look at, so if they harden the grid or maybe the most key components of it, to where every single storm they're not having to replace these things, that's probably a positive. But what does that cost? And you're going to get a surcharge for that too. And so what surcharge is bigger? Is it the one that you get hit with every couple of years after a hurricane passes and they have to come rebuild everything? Or is it the one where, they spent $15 billion, or I'm just throwing out a number, to harden the grid, and then you get a surcharge for that, and how does it all work in conjunction with each other, which one? But I mean, it seems like at some point, even they don't want to have to continue to do this every single year, and I think there are places where, maybe you can't harden the whole thing at once, but maybe you start taking those steps. Yes, sir.
You'll have to forgive me for veering off into the speculative, but there's been some talk amongst some Republican circles that the trial lawyers may be prepared to line up behind you as a candidate for governor in 2023, and perhaps the funding of same may even be enough to scare off a potential Democratic strong candidate like Senator Smith. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll comment in general. I don't know who would be willing to line up against behind me or not behind me, but I think in general, as of today, I'm not a declared candidate. It's something that I'm having discussions with my family about. My goal would be, if I were to run, and were to become a candidate at some point, I would certainly hope to not just have any one particular group supporting me, but a lot of groups. I think that what I have shown in my time in the legislature is that I work with anybody and everybody, as long as we're trying to work towards the right thing. So I have not heard the thing, the portion about the trial lawyers lining up behind me, but appreciate you giving me that insight. Yes, sir. Either.
Speaking of the infrastructure again, so with the I-10 widening project, even if in the long term it's a good thing, there's going to be a lot of hardship on the private sector in the meantime, for however long it takes. I know state government has talked about going with a 4-day work week to maybe alleviate some traffic. Are there other things the state government can do, or things that can be done from your perspective that could alleviate that hardship in the meantime as the project is ongoing?
I wish I had a better answer for that. I'm not sure the exact number of state employees, but hopefully that will alleviate some of the pressure. I think that it's one of those things when you're trying to, it's growing pains to a certain extent, and that's frustrating to everybody, whether it's your business that it impacts or just your daily commute. But I don't know any other way around it other than maybe having started with a different project, which is, I don't make those calls, but I think that would have possibly been the only other alternative is if you had done some things, maybe chosen some other things. And look, I don't get to see everything, so they may have some information that says that would have been the worst choice imaginable, but if you had done some other projects of a similar value that would have given people an alternative route to take and then circled back and done that one, maybe that would have alleviated some of the pressure. Yes, sir.
I know you think you've answered this already, but I believe that those 8 towers that were knocked out by Ida in New Orleans dated all the way back to the days of Louisiana Power and Light. Now, is there anything we can do to prevent public utilities from waiting until an event knocks stuff out so they can get it into the rate base after?
I think we can take a look at that. It's certainly something that can be discussed, and we'll try and get some of those answers when we have them in committee. And it was touched on a little bit. I think that it's certainly, if you look at some of the pictures and things, it would make you question whether or not they had been kind of left for a longer period of time. So I guess my bigger question is whether they do it inside of a storm or outside of a storm. I think we're ultimately all paying for it anyway, but wouldn't it be better if it was done as some ongoing maintenance as opposed to having to be done all at once while everybody's waiting around to get power? So I do know that there were still multiple feeds going into New Orleans. There were so many issues going on down there in terms of the power grid, really everywhere, but it goes back to not just those main lines, but what goes on kind of more at the ground level, at the neighborhood level, and all those sorts of things and how that works. But it is something we need to look at and maybe at the very least do what we can to urge them to continue with ongoing maintenance and not wait until they have to do it all at one time. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to follow up on AT&T, has anyone from there talked to the legislature about what specifically they're going to do to make sure those sort of breakdowns don't happen again? Have those communications happened, or are you waiting for the next joint commerce meeting?
So at the first joint commerce meeting, they did not provide details on that. They said they just did not have the information yet. I do believe at the next joint commerce meeting that hopefully they will provide some of that, at least give us a better explanation as to what happened, and what they, more importantly than what happened, what they intend to do to make sure it doesn't happen again, assuming that they continue to be the group that provides that emergency service. So yeah, I think that question will have to be answered. We just have to get to that point, and they have to go back and evaluate everything and see. I know it was I think there were some things, like in one particular instance, I think maybe a tree fell and the root system ripped the lines out completely and broke them in half. I don't know what you do to prevent something like that, but we'll get those answers hopefully sooner than later. Let me get back, and then I'll come back to you.
Have you gotten any sense yet from the Public Service Commission what kind of surcharges people are looking at on their bills for IDA, how long they would go, and do you see the legislature having any role in trying to rein that in or put confines around what can happen there?
So I don't think they have any idea yet what that might look like until they get a solid sense of what the total replacement and damage and everything is going to be. And then of course there will be some dialogue and probably negotiation with the power companies and the PSC in terms of what they will allow them to pass on. I know if you go back to Katrina, I feel like that one just fell off for some people, and to kind of give a sense of how long they can stay on. And the main reason I know that is because I feel like maybe within the last 2 years I had a constituent that called and asked why they were still paying it. And so I know they can last a long time. It's not like a 3-year thing. It's probably more like a 10+ year thing.
So I know you say you want to move away from using federal dollars for infrastructure, but there's the best we can, but there's those two major infrastructure bills on Capitol Hill, namely the bipartisan bill that would have a lot of funds for like the Mississippi Bridge and such. Are you in support of those?
Well, I mean, I don't really have. I would like any dollars that we can get a hold of in order to do the things we need to do. But at the same time, I don't want them to be careless, and I'm not for them being careless, and I haven't paid really close attention to what they're doing, but they operate very differently in terms of, if we have an infrastructure bill, it absolutely has to deal with roads and bridges. They can have an infrastructure bill and it can deal with an whole assortment of things, and so for me, while I desperately want to see those things get done, I want to make sure that it's whatever comes out of Washington is done in as responsible a way as possible. So whenever I say I want us to start steering away from federal dollars, I want to see us get all the federal dollars we can get. But what I do want to see is us growing the percentage of state dollars we use by reallocation or whatever, things like that, in an effort to not rely on them, because when you're as reliant on them as we are, it just slows everything down, because you have to wait on them to move forward.
So in your opinion, what would you consider to be an appropriate reliance percentage for federal dollars?
I don't know what the appropriate percentage is, but like I said, I think roughly just under 80%, so like 78% or so of our dollars spent on infrastructure in Louisiana is from the federal government. The average state is somewhere in the 40-something percentile. So you're talking about a major gap there. It's not like we're right there in the middle of the pack. I mean, we're a major outlier, and so that's the main thing for me is the percentage doesn't matter as much as the ability to move more freely and actually get projects done when we tell our constituents they're paid for and ready to go.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank y'all. Okay.
And of course, we'll be back here Monday. Melinda, do we know who our speaker is by chance, Monday? Has it not been? Check out the local news media to find out who our speaker